Good afternoon, everyone, and very welcome to today's Irish Landscape Institute webinar. Today, Lorraine Bull is going to give us a talk on ecological corridors from the city to the sea. Lorraine is Executive Biodiversity Officer in Fingal County Council, with responsible for Natura 2000 sites, coastal areas and estuaries. Prior to this, she was Dublin City's Biodiversity Officer for 5 years and has sat on the board of the Dublin Bay UNESCO Biosphere Reserve since 2019. Lorraine holds a BA in Natural Science, Zoology from Trinity College Dublin, and has qualifications in environmental and planning legislation. So without further ado, I'm delighted to hand over to Lorraine.
Hi, Mark. Thanks so much. And thank you to Mark, the Institute, for inviting me to speak, and also to Hazel for the logistical support this week as well. So as Mark outlined there, I'm the Executive Biodiversity Officer in Fingal. There's a team of us in biodiversity. I'm just going to give an overview today about ecological corridors. It's quite a broad subject, so you could actually do multiple talks. But without further ado, I thought I'd talk about why we actually need corridors, just as a little bit of an introduction. So unfortunately, we have degraded habitat, and humans' activity has caused habitat to fragment into smaller patches. So this could be as simple as building a road through a woodland. And why this causes an impact is, you can see on the left here, you have an interior habitat that's continuous, and it has interior species. And this will be a mix of predator and prey animals. And then you have an edge habitat with edge species. But once you start building a road, fragmenting it, as you can see on the right-hand side, the interior habitat shrinks. So the interior species actually reduce in number. And initially the edge habitat with the edge species, so these are species that have evolved to live at the edges of this particular habitat, they'll increase, but then over time, through competition and predation, they'll actually decline. So when you start dividing up areas, you cause impacts, initial impacts for the species, but then also what you can do is cause that habitat to further fragment. So generally habitat decline, and while habitats actually fragment, if it's not such a clear cut as an instant road, can actually be that the habitat is actually declining already. And that's why it starts getting broken up. So again, you can see here on the left, the continuous piece. And then as over time, it gets broken up, it gets more and more and more fragmented. So this causes further kind of species decline. Increased distance makes it difficult from one species to move from one area to another. But also species living in these areas become isolated. So when we're talking about isolation, we're actually talking about genetic diversity. It's not the fact that they're feeling a bit lonely like we would. And really how this has an impact is it impacts what we call gene flow, or the genetic diversity within that area. So things like fatal diseases can spread more rapidly. And this is where you then starting working towards extinction at local levels. Now, unfortunately, habitat fragmentation due to human development is an increasing threat to biodiversity. There is no habitat on the planet where we haven't had some sort of impact across several different ways. So ecological corridors, they were actually in the literature, they're sort of first discussed in the middle of the last century. But this is a definition here that was actually cited in law in the US. So avenues along which wide-ranging animals can travel, plants can propagate, genetic interchange can occur, populations can move in respect to environmental changes, which could also be, climate change and natural disasters such as fires. And also threatened species can be replenished from other areas. So where you have areas of habitat that you've got local extinction level events, species can then, from other areas, can then repopulate that. But they're also called green corridors, blue corridors, wildlife corridors, habitat corridors. And within the ecological corridor ethos, there's actually different types of corridors. So really, as I say, they facilitate connectivity between areas, and this enables species to access food, water, shelter, but also other mates. Individuals, as I say, they can access own species, that's gene flow, And also it can help reduce impact caused by human activities such as road and housing. I use sort of can help and reduce because some corridors have greater value than others. Just as a simple schematic here, you can see that there's different types of corridors. So there's the crossings. So these are the overpasses or underpasses around sort of major roads like motorways. There's connective habitat. So this is where you have sort of uninterrupted area of natural land. And that connects the corridor there actually connects to two or more of these larger habitats. And I've got some examples of that from a Dublin perspective just coming up in this talk. And then stepping stones, this is where the unconnected habitat areas that can provide shelter, food between some of these larger habitat hubs. But really the stepping stones are more valuable for mobile species to move from one place to another. So kind of moving on, you've got, landscape corridors, you've got linear corridors, the stepping stones, as I've discussed there. And the landscape elements, really, these are, diverse and uninterrupted landscape, and they provide cover for a range of species. So these are really where we want to try and work towards if we're actually designing and building ecological corridors. The linear corridors, I think, are more in line with like what we have in an urban environment, for example. And then moving on from that, you want to start forming these ecological networks. So this is where you've got these uninterrupted patches of land, you'll have ecological corridors between them, and then you'll also have a buffer zone around that. And in Fingal, we actually have these measures as part of the Biodiversity Action Plan, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So some of the limitations of corridors is that they can be very species specific. So they suit a lot of mobile species, birds, bats, and flying insects. They can suit some plant species, but it depends on the type of habitat and also the size of the corridor. So they must have suitable habitat, for the species that they're targeting. Sometimes as well, because animals will have their own habitat requirements, they can also act as a barrier to other species because they don't have the habitat requirements they need. And then also as well, from an animal's perspective, animals have evolved over a long period of time into what we call ecological niches. So these really are where an animal sits within an ecosystem. So a good example of this would be bat species. So along a bat corridor, along a river corridor, you could have 3 or 4 species of bat that are actually using the same stretch of river. But you have a Dorbenton's bat, which flies just off the surface of the water. You have common and pipistrelle bats, which sort of fly at hedgerow height. And then you have Leisler bats, which fly up ahead. So all of these bats have worked out these little niches over time that they can all avail of the same resources. There's also some animals that have territories. So again, if you're designing a corridor or looking at corridors, you have to sort of factor that in to make sure there's enough sort of area for them. Sadly, also as well, invasive species can spread into corridors if not managed properly. So I've actually seen that just recently this week where there's some hedgerows that have been overcut. They've been cut back so much you could almost actually do with replanting them. And what's happened in the meantime then is other plant species have actually spread into that habitat. So what would have been a really natural native hedgerow for a lot of species is now being taken over by invasive species. But also as well, size and complexity, also the amount of plants that are in, the type of habitat, it adds value to the corridor. So the larger the corridor, the greater potential for a number of species. And again, if they're too narrow or too small, they mightn't be effective. Or again, if they're maintained poorly. So these are all the things you have to consider or factor in when you're actually looking at ecological corridors. And scale is a really, really important factor. So if you're planning a corridor, I thought I'd throw this in just because that might be something that you're doing. Parks, open spaces, natural areas provide a range of habitats and resources for wildlife. Also as well, they could be improved. So the number one sort of step from an ecological corridor is also improving the habitat types that you're trying to connect. But also as well, sometimes when you think you're doing something right for biodiversity. You could be doing something, an action that's good for one species, but not necessarily another. So here I like using the example of light-bellied brent geese. So here in Dublin, we have internationally important numbers of light-bellied brent geese that travel here over 4,500 kilometers from Arctic Canada. Now, the geese, when they arrive, they'll feed on seagrass beds and algae out in Dublin Bay in the estuaries. And then over the winter months, they actually move inland, and they really like feeding on the amenity grasslands, the sports pitches. And these are very short, sweet, heavily fertilized areas, and the geese will actually help fertilize them as well. But if you're, say, designing a park where you have a brent goose feeding site and you're saying, well, right, I'd love actually to create a really lovely big wildflower meadow in the summer, that's actually two different management regimes. So by its nature, creating a wildflower meadow, you want to actually weaken the grass species. And if you want to plant yellow rattle, that'll parasitize the grass. So it's just a different management aspect. So again, if you're doing a corridor, it's important as a pre-plan to look at the existing habitats and the species that are on the ground. Avoiding sort of sensitive habitat that exists already, such as the species-rich grasslands. Again, we have them across Dublin County. And make sure if you are, say, doing any planting schemes, that you're not replacing, rare plants like bee orchids, pyramidal orchids, things like that. So here in Ireland, the way you can check that is through the data centre, the National Biodiversity Data Centre, BSBI or Birdwatch or Naturalist Field Club. They'll all have records. And a lot of that is detailed on the NBDC website. Now, your local authority could have that information. That could be in your local biodiversity action plan. And also as well, if you're looking at a corridor, look at the local scale and also the broader connectivity across the city, because you're wanting to connect spaces together. So from a very small scale, I thought I'd use the example of the solitary bee. So there's been a big promotion both here in Ireland, but in other countries, to try and increase habitat for bee species, for example, and create corridors. So I would have worked on with community groups, trying to create bee corridors, in very urban environments. So as an example, bumblebees, they would generally like foraging within a couple of 100 meters of their nesting site. So they won't create a hive, they'll actually create a nest. And that'll be under a hedgerow, that'll be in a bank. And then they will forage, as part of their territory from the nest. So you want to then provide areas of forage for them. But then if you look at solitary bees, so this little bee here on the right-hand side, that's a mining bee. And they commonly forage within about 300 meters of their nest. But interestingly, studies have shown that if there's an increase in even just 150 meters between their nest site and the food source, it can actually reduce the number of their viable offspring by more than 70%. So that has, a massive knock-on effect for that species. So again, if you're looking at creating a corridor for bees, you could think, well, right, where are the potential nesting sites, or where do I need to maybe start creating some? Insect hotels are not always that successful. So really what you can do is, ground nesting birds, solitary mining bees, they really like, well-drained south sunny or west facing bank. Or you can use sort of well-drained flat ground. And you can, if you're mapping out your corridor, you can say, well, right, these are where all the habitat or nesting sites are, and then you build from there. So then the next step is looking at sort of potential forage sites, or where, you can create them. And this is just a very basic schematic where bee, will fly from one site to another. But again, it's just important from a landscape scale, just looking at also that smaller scale, for those particular species. And again, you could have pyramidal orchids, within that area. I'm just putting this in. I'm happy for this to be a PDF. There's just a couple of links in here to some extra resources. But here in Ireland, there's the All Ireland Pollinator Plan with a lot of information for pollinators. And one thing to factor in as well, so native insects are involved with native plants and also trees. And really that provides, the best nutrition and the best availability of food. There is a lag, like in June. and that's where then some of the other planting schemes really kick in. And just this is very recent, so the top 10 recorded food sites, from people sending in sightings included dandelions, thistles, and also clover. And clover, has been sort of the #1 food plant for bees, like back in the 1950s. So that's just a little bit on pollinator corridors, safe, within an urban environment. So here in Dublin, but in other urban environments, but cities as well, and also in the countryside, we have blue or river corridors. So these really are our most important corridors that we have, or some of the most important corridors that we have across the city. So they really are vital for a range of both terrestrial but also aquatic species. And here in Dublin, we're lucky. We have, kingfishers, which you can see in the top right. We have dipper that's in the middle. We have otter. So otter now have been surveyed across the whole of the Dublin region. The bat on the bottom right, that's the Dorbenton's bat. And also there's brown trout, but also salmon as well. And in a lot of other cities, they wouldn't have, say capital cities and surrounds, they wouldn't have the range of these species. But also as well, like the rivers and the riparian corridors. So that's the land, the riparian zone is the land either side of the river. And I can't stress enough, these are really, really critical to the natural functioning of the river. So trees, shrubs, dead wood, fallen trees in the water, they provide habitat and shade for species. So including the likes of Atlantic salmon and brown trout, because they will or are very, very sensitive to temperature. So especially linked to climate change, we have, warming rivers, warming oceans, and our fish species are coming under, greater pressure. So providing, really healthy riparian corridors is really, really important to these species. But also as well, river corridors provide ecosystem services to us. So they stabilize banks, that's the trees and the shrubs. It reduces channel erosion, slows down the flow of water, which helps to mitigate impacts of climate change, because you want to slow down the water before it enters the river to help reduce flooding. But also it helps control sediment going into the water, but also runoff, so both nutrient and also chemicals, heading into the river corridor. So across Fingal Council, there's different actions for helping our river corridors. So this is part of the Ward River project that's happening in Fingal at the moment. So you can see over time in these two images here that we have extensively modified all of our river corridors. That's the building of, water wheels, weirs, fish passes, etc. And that really has, we've also straightened rivers and culverted and covered them in many, many places. So really what we're looking to do in Fingal through Biodiversity Action Plan in Parks and Planning is looking at, removing some of these barriers. Ideally, you would do this at a catchment level scale, but at least this is part of a project that is working towards that. So here you can see on the left-hand side, you've got old existing weirs, and then these were actually removed last year. And there was also tons of rock armor. There was actually 3 layers of rock armor that was put in the river. And that was all removed. Then you can see in the next picture here, this is the same site. So I'll just go back. That's the same site. And what's happened is, though, that has been removed, and also some of the shingle and shale here has been left at the side. So this provides habitat for succession planting. So here there's been, we're actually waiting to see actually what are the different species that actually grow along the river, rather than just doing a mass planting initially. But also there are national monuments along the river as well. So in these cases, there's actually fish passes that have been installed. So this is a large one here that has gone in, and really the fish pass provides a channel for the fish actually to swim down, and it doesn't actually damage the fish. So to go back to sort of the traditional fish barriers, to put it in context, so for Atlantic salmon, for every barrier that it meets, only a third of the fish actually get through. And that happens at every barrier. So you can see then how these barriers then really help cause the decline in species, because they're being impacted at every single location. But also as well, when they go through the fish barriers, they can get cuts and grazes, which can also help, damage them. So this is another project in Castle Curragh in Mulhuddet. And this actually is looking at restoring meanders to straightened rivers. So there's actually, you can see like some of the passage in here, and then there was a section that was actually straightened. So we're looking at actually restoring the meander and also keeping that riparian corridor. But you can also install riffle pool glides in a river, and you can also daylight enclosed rivers as well. So now, so some guidance here in Ireland for rivers would be Inland Fisheries Ireland. So this is their planning for watercourses document in the urban environment. So this has guidance in terms of riparian zones and the depths that you need for your riparian zones. So you can see, excuse me, the fisherman here, he's within sort of the first 10 meters of the river. And a lot of river banks actually that I see, they have very, very narrow riparian zones, so they need to be expanded. So you can see on this page here, this in a little bit greater detail. So you have your streamside zone, you have then your middle zone. So this is your tree bank, this is your shrubs, and then you can have an outer zone, which also provides additional SUDS measures. So there's little ponds. Some of these could be seasonal ponds. Some of these could be permanent pond structures. And they will also help, species like amphibians. Just to show you, there's some other resources. So creating and managing riparian woodland from the forest strategy in the UK. And also there's an organisation called the Tweed Forum based up the Scottish borders. And they also have some guidelines. So I just thought I'd put these in just if anybody is interested in having a look at this. So when we're looking at sort of scales, so we've got, we've gone from our solitary bee, which is very, very small, very local scale, along our, ecological rivers. We are in a biodiversity and climate crisis, both here nationally, but also internationally. And really what we need to do is work at the landscape scale. So this includes, you can see, this is a really good schematic, I thought, just showing this in detail. Let me just, you're covering actually where I can see. So you can see here, we have, native cover, native vegetation. So this is providing core habitat. We have here a floodplain here, and this gets naturally inundated. So this triggers, plant regeneration. So I'll be showing you some photographs of Turvey, but we have a lot of estuaries and salt marshes in Fingal Council. And we're actually looking at acquiring lands to try and extend those salt marsh areas, because that helps also with, flood retention, but carbon capture, and also providing habitat for species. Also creating these sort of long corridors. You'll have lots of migratory species that will use this, such as the brent geese, but you'll have other species as well that will move from one area to the other. You've got grasslands, you've got habitat, you've got pasture. So as you see, we've gone from a very, very kind of urban environment, but even here you've got, sensitively designed, urban parks and gradients, and they contribute to habitats for native species. So to put in context, for say across a city like Dublin, like within the Dublin city limits, like a third of the habitat is actually private gardens. So private gardens, public parks can really, have a real positive impact for biodiversity if, the sites are managed, and also then corridors are formed between each of those. So I know there's been discussions about, forming, corridors across different parts of the city, and that is the same for Fingal as well. But also linear strips of roadside, providing vegetation, both hedgerows, stepping stones we have in here. So this I think really kind of encompasses where we need to get to from a landscape scale, and also buffers around, protected natural areas. And then you have, freer flowing rivers here as well, where fish can go up and down the river. So from a Dublin point of view, the corridors that we have at that kind of landscape, larger ecological scale, are actually our Natura 2000 sites. So across the whole of Dublin, so you can see here this is up in Skerries, this is the actual city, and all the way up along the Fingal coast and then down the Irish Sea and into the bay, we actually have a Natura 2000 network. So this is an EU network of protected areas that have been designated. So special areas of conservation for habitats or special protection area for birds. And these are to safeguard Europe's, most valuable and threatened species and habitats. But really key to the Natura 2000 ethos and actually enshrined within the articles of the Habitats Directive are ecological corridors. So they're regarded as a real key component for improving, the network's coherence, its connectivity, and facilitating wildlife movement between, protected areas. So some of our protected areas in Fingal would be Howth Head, Island's Eye. You can see here in these hatched areas, it's a big proportion of the estuary areas and also the marine areas as well. So across Fingal, thinking back to the kind of ecological network landscape scale model for ecological corridors, we have our core sites. So these are our designated sites that I just outlined there, the SACs and SPAs. But then we have our buffer zones. So these are around these core sites, and they're important. They provide additional habitat. They allow wildlife to spread out from those core sites. So for example, again, you can see the Brent geese in this picture. We actually did a 4-year satellite tagging survey of Brent geese across Dublin Bay. And that enabled us to see, okay, where are the areas that the geese are using? What's their preference for certain habitats, or what sort of times are they using those habitats? So from there, what you can do is you can take your plan and you can actually then extend and start protecting areas and making sure, okay, well, those areas there are for Brent geese, for example, and other areas then you can put aside, for pollinators, and also see, what other native plants, etc., are growing. And also the buffer zones, provide additional resting sites, for example. So there's quite a few of those, around the Fingal region. Then also as well, we have nature development areas. So these are, areas of land where we feel there are great opportunities, to work and to provide habitat and forage for wildlife. So these comprise, farmland areas, domains, parklands, quarries, golf courses, and also various water bodies like the rivers, canals, wetlands, and also our woodlands. And also as well, a key component for the success of an ecological corridor is actually working with the local community. So working with the landowners, working with the local residents, working with the community in order to develop that corridor. It helps to get buy-in. Sometimes people can sort of say, oh God, like when Natura 2000 was announced, there was oh, are people going to come along and, take over the land, or what's going to happen? And it's not about that. It's about actually working with the landowners to try and help biodiversity as much as possible. Also as well in Fingal, as I say, we have, corridors as part of our ecological network. And this allows, wildlife to move through countryside, but also the towns. Really crucially, I mean, our rivers are our kind of key corridors, but also around, as you see, the estuaries and the other green patches there. And we are actually doing sort of multiple projects across, the city in order to look at restoring natural areas and restoring natural processes. So I know some of you might be hopefully coming on a site visit. So this actually is Turvey Nature Park, which is up in Donabate. So this is a site of former farmland, which is sits adjacent to the Rogerstown estuary. So the Rogerstown estuary at the site, is a key feeding ground for a lot of overwintering birds, but then also a lot of seabirds and other birds as well. So what's happened over, say, the last 20 years at this site is there's been various different measures to provide a range of habitats, but also to restore natural processes. So there's been woodland planting, there's been, hedgerow planting. There's also been allowing areas just to naturalize, just to see what nature does. So here is some of the ponds. I was actually at them this morning. So these are a series of ponds that have been put in since 2010. So the first ponds were dug in 2010, and then from there they've been expanded in both from 2020 and 22. So these are a network of ponds of differing shapes and sizes and differing depths, and they have sort of margins at the side that again are at different heights, because really what you want to do is try and provide as much habitat as possible for a range of species. So in the summer months, this site is absolutely teeming with nesting birds, water birds. And also as well, there's a local birdwatch group who we've helped support install a sand martin bank, and they've had sand martin there just literally in the past week. So this really has become a very, very important place that borders the estuary. And that's just another picture of the pond there. And as I say, there's a lot of duck species and other species that use the site in the summer. This is just part of the works. So on the site picture here, sort of a down, like on the far right-hand side of here, you actually start moving in towards the estuary. So just along the estuary edge here, we actually scraped up some of the soil in order to allow, that's why I was showing in that large schematic, for the area to become inundated. So this is an area which has provided now brackish, that's a mix of saline and fresh water. So it's predominantly brackish along there. And in times of high water, in times of heavy rainfall, this area will actually slightly flood and also populate. But this also provides a range of habitat for a lot of plant species, but also we have a lot of birds here as well. And we have a lot of rare birds that actually come. Some are breeding birds, some are actually just overwintering. And also as well in the park, we have, sacrificial crops. And literally adjacent to this site, as I say, is the Rogerstown estuary, and both in Rogerstown and other places, we're actually looking at, as I say, acquiring areas of salt marsh. So coastal ecosystems have high carbon sequestration rates. You can see that there, the tidal salt marshes, seagrass meadows. And this is part of a bigger plan. So the whole of Turvey is developed into a larger scale corridor, which has a mosaic of different habitat types, can facilitate a lot of different species, but also, people can visit the site and see the wildlife as well. And then it has, a value in terms of carbon sequestration. So here's just some take-home points. So consider the ecology of the species you're trying to help and the habitat it needs. Consider, existing habitats and species. So, don't replace important habitats. You see, and we need to plant trees. I absolutely agree with that. But sometimes trees might be planted in areas that should be wetlands, and vice versa. Sometimes you might put in a wetland where you should have maybe a woodland. So it's just really looking at that. And then just considering the scale, considering the connectivity, and trying to link up. In Fingal, we can link up these core natural areas and parks, and in some urban environments, you mightn't have those as much or as many. So again, you can link up, those parks to other natural areas, and then provide, more habitat for a range of species. And then incorporating native trees where possible, hedgerows, plants, but also in an urban environment, green biodiverse roofs, you know, can have real positive impact as well, and also ponds. And one thing would just be to caution about invasive species. So there's species on the 3rd schedule of the regulations, which you know, you're not supposed to plant. But even other invasive species, the likes of buddleia now, we're seeing is actually just overly invasive. So, and actually only accommodates a few butterfly species. So there could be other species that you plant there instead, or you just allow it to naturalize over time. So also, if you're doing a scheme, it could also be a good idea to have an ecologist, or if you're in a local authority, have a biodiversity officer to draw up the corridor plan. Because again, that person could have a look at those different habitats and species and sort of guide you. So really, our planet will only survive if its ecosystems are connected, and also healthy biodiversity and ecosystems are essential for climate resilience. And that's really where we need to get to, is to allow those ecosystems to function, you know, at a healthy level. I put in some resources there just for you just to have a look at. But yeah, so that is kind of a whistle-stop tour. I know there's a lot of information in that. You know, 35 minutes. I've actually kind of stuck to time, actually, Mark. I'm surprised myself. But it gives time for questions as well. So anyway, I hope that was helpful for you all, and I'll hand back to Mark.
Thanks a million, Lorraine. If you want to get a drink of water and take a few breaths there, I can wrap it on for a minute. So anyone who would like to pose a question, you can pop it in the chat there, or you can turn on your camera and ask it in person. So Lorraine was asked or mentioned ILI walking tour of Turvey, which we're hopefully organising, and there are obviously future CPD sessions as well at the lunchtime on the internet. But main thing is to stay in touch via the website, and you'll get the information on upcoming sessions there. So, Lorraine, I was surprised to notice that the Brent Geese are members of Portmarnock Golf Club. They like to do a bit of golfing, apparently. It's quite surprising.
Yeah, so again, you can have golf courses, and actually I should say, so up at Turvey, there's lands that border Turvey. You know, there's Beaverstown Golf Club, and also there's a site called Rahillion where we're looking at, you know, transplanting a wildflower meadow. So again, golf courses are highly managed. So the geese seem to have really adapted or discovered that amenity areas and other areas have got that short, sweet grass. And so they also favor those. But also as well, golf courses will generally have a fence around them. So during the daytime areas, they also need resting sites. So in times where the golf courses are not being used as often, they could also use them just as locations to rest as well.
Right. Thanks. Message or a question from Alistair, and actually I'll just preface this question by saying that Lorraine's kindly agreed to share the PDF of her talk, so we'll be able to get all the links and references after the fact, and also the talk will be up on YouTube in due course as well if you want to go back over anything. But Alistair would like to know, are you able to share an example of constructed San Martin bank? He's looking at installing one on a scheme at the moment.
Yeah, so from an urban perspective, a lot of the San Martin banks are now actually, if I stop sharing, Mark, actually, I can
Hmm.
probably dig out. I'm thinking, do I have a photograph of it? But if not, I can send you a photograph. So in Turvey Nature, we have a constructed bank. So that sits at the side of the pond. There's some that are built for, you know, very urban channels. So they're either a mix of concrete or other materials. But also as well, if you have, you know, if you're along the coast, I don't know where you're based, Alistair, but if you're along the coast, or if you have a site that's suitable, you could look at building up, you know, an actual sand dune. Off the top of my head, I don't know of an example of one of those types. And actually, possibly the RSPB could have done something like that in the UK. But certainly in the San Martin Bank in Turvey, it's only been in a couple of years, so it's hoped that it's going to be used this summer. So I don't know if that's helpful, Alistair, but certainly I could send you on information on those particular San Martin projects that we have used here in Dublin.
Thanks, Lorraine. Yeah, we're looking at one in Timon Park, South Dublin, also adjacent to or sort of overlooking a constructed wetland.
Mm-hmm.
So it'll be a similar sort of situation. So as natural as possible, I suppose, is what we're looking for. But we don't really know. I mean, if we sort of bank up sand, is that going to be firm enough for the sand martins
Well,
to?
well, certainly on the coast, there will be, areas along the coast that, the sand martins will use. But one thing as well, from a monitoring point of view, like the benefit to the one in Turvey is that you can actually get in, and the unit that in is you can actually remove each tunnel and you can replace the sand, but you can also see if, other species nesting in it. So in terms of material, I'd need to check that with Birdwatch actually to see even if they've had success, because as I say, the ones I've only used have been more the artificial kind. But we could certainly check that, Alistair, and it'd be worth having a look. It'd be worth maybe comparing, say, the one in Timon Park, with the one in Turvey. Is there greater success with one of them, than the other? So.
Yeah, great, thanks.
Thanks, Lorraine.
And another quick question, if I can. Is there an online resource for good wetland plants that you know of?
I don't, but I can check, because generally as well with a lot of projects, a lot of them can be quite site specific. So I gave a couple of examples there just for rivers, but again, it would depend where you're based. So I can't think of one off the top of my head, but certainly I could have a look at that and have a chat with you about that as well.
Right, so we have a
Great,
lot
thanks.
of thank you messages coming in, Lorraine, so I'm not going to read all of them out, or we'll have no time for questions, but a lot of nice comments there. So Lei Ching would like to know more about the level of biodiversity in Dublin, and how do you think it's possible for to incorporate adaptive solutions for climate change?
Well, yes, it is possible, but we need to be scaling it up. We need to be doing, an awful lot more. And I think some of it actually comes down to funding, and funding for specific projects. So climate action will get, or has received, quite a bit of funding, but if it was up to me now, I'd maybe funnel that in other directions. But no, there's a lot of, and especially from an urban environment, especially a city, there are multiple tools that you need to use in order to help biodiversity. But it's one of those where you'd actually look at the actual site and see what the requirements are. So I don't know if that helps to answer, because that's quite a big question. You could actually probably have a talk just on that in itself. So.
Great. Digby Brady, Landscape Architects, would like you to comment on the pros and cons of non-native, non-invasive species, in particular in urban areas. So species that aren't native but aren't invasive either, and their use in urban areas, the pros and cons. Another big question.
So as I say, depending if for, say, pollinator corridors you're wanting to produce, it's been shown, I mean, both the pollinator plan, but also the RHS lists, and that's where the pollinator plan lists come from, have been shown, especially within the months of June, to have benefit to wildlife. What we have seen, though, over the last number of years is I think a misunderstanding of two things. One is honeybees and the requirement for honeybees within urban environments, and also wildflower seed mixes. So you could sort of compare it to McDonald's versus a really healthy, nutritious meal. So there'll be some plant species, like I have them even in my own garden, the likes of salvias, for example, the pollinators absolutely love, but also you know, keeping those dandelions, keeping that clover. To be honest, there are masses of lists. Like if you look at the RHS list for plants, there's an awful lot there for them. But one thing would be worth considering is, you know, the other species that are in an area. So that, I guess, would be the con, is that you would maybe overplant existing habitats and existing plants that are providing actually better value for certain species. But there's a balance, and I'm aware that, you know, in urban parks in particular, you know, you are wanting to create, you know, planting schemes. So what I would do actually is look at the RHS lists and actually choose plants for throughout the year. So bees are coming out at a time when there's sort of a dearth of resources. So have that very spring planting, you know, that a lot of that will be bulbs. Then, you know, this time of year, you know, there's bees all over dandelions. In summer months it'll move into clover, but then there's other lists depending on where your habitats are. So that's really what you want to do if you're doing, say, a pollinator list, is you're wanting to provide that forage throughout the year. And then crucially, and that's the bit I saw certainly working in urban environment before, is not providing those areas of habitat. And they're, you know, really crucial. So yeah, there's pluses and minuses for both.
Yep. So Maria would a question on bees and bumblebees, and she's wondering about protecting their habitats and any tips for identifying their habitats and for the protection of the same. So it's things to look out for on a site visit that might alert you to bee and bumblebee
Yes.
habitat across seasons, I suppose.
So well, bumblebees will produce, so actually I could show you the, let me just go back to this image here. So within this site here, you've actually got a bank of soil that's in here. Within this soil bank here, you can actually see, now this is more for solitary bees, but also under hedgerows. So for bumblebees, for example, they will generally like nesting, you know, under hedgerows. So if you were going into an area that had a hedgerow, like hedgerows, I could have also and should have also probably talked more about hedgerows for corridors as well, but it was just a time factor. So hedgerows provide both habitat, you know, nesting sites, you know, for bees, for birds, but also amount of forage. So if you have a nice mix of a native hedgerow species also with tree species, you're actually providing a lot of that before you then even need to do a lot more additional work in terms of forage. So to help protect those, if you have those hedgerow areas, if you have like loose banks of soil, is actually then, you know, creating a 3 to 5, even further meter, depending on how much land you have, area where you actually allow that to naturalize, to allow that to grow. And not overplant or build on top of that. That would provide you know, a better protection for those sites. So that would be something I would look at. And I suppose as well, from a hedgerow point of view, or just even from trees, you know, there's a lot of, say, through planning, where I'll see, you know, the comments time and time again, look, we're going to have to remove a hedgerow, we're going to have to remove this line of trees, and then we're going to have to come back in and, well, but it's fine because we'll plant new ones. It takes years for hedgerows to develop, both the hedgerow species themselves, but for the wider biodiversity use. So if you're ripping out areas of existing habitat and then overplanting, it's going to take, you know, 10, 15 plus years for that biodiversity to come back again. So that's something to consider as well, is trying to retain as much of existing habitat that's on the site. That's good habitat, you know, so.
Thanks, Lorraine. Jamie was wondering if you could go back to the slide that shows the carbon
Oh, yes.
sequestration of different habitats, please. Yeah. And then he is wondering where did you get your information from, and were you on a course where you learnt this?
Well, this slide, actually, I have to give credit to this to Hans Visser, because this is one of Hans. So Hans, the senior biodiversity officer in the council, and this was one of the slides he's used. So some of these slides were from other presentations that Fingal Biodiversity has done. So that there has been adapted from La Folie, I think is how you say that, and Grimsditch. So I can send you the link to that. But just in general, I mean, even some of the other graphics I showed you, generally, if you're reading around a topic, and like I would have studied ecological corridors in college and would have then done work on ecological corridors, but there's always new information to learn. So always what I do if I'm doing any sort of research is go to Google Scholar and have a look at the peer-reviewed papers. There's a lot of information on the internet about a whole range of different things, but if you go to Google Scholar and if you look at the peer-reviewed, it means other scientists have reviewed that data. So say, for example, there was an issue with that graph that was presented. The people reviewing that paper before it's get published would have said, actually, there's a mistake here. So it's not saying that all the information is correct that's out there that's peer reviewed, but you're far better, and also reading around the subject. But in terms of courses, there are courses that you can do. And certainly if you send in an email to us, I'll be able to provide you with links to some courses. And there's also some seminars and webinars that you can, especially for estuaries. There's an estuaries and coastal association, kind of similar to the ILI, that you can attend, lectures, seminars, etc.
Thank you, Lorraine. Look, that's absolutely fascinating. I know, back in the day, my 20, 30 years ago, it was all about planting trees and forests. The last 10 or plus years, the emphasis, I'm talking about now in an Irish context, the emphasis has understandably moved back to peatlands and re-wetting peatlands and the value of wetlands. But I had no idea that tidal salt marshes were that powerful when it came to carbon sequestration. And I do wonder how many other people out there are aware of that, because it's great news in that regard.
And it's one of those where I was looking at something even recently. I was actually an association, discussion about this, and there certainly are some both, well, in the UK, but also Europe and America, where they have done, much larger scale ecological restoration, like along estuaries. And they are talking about this more. But to put it into context, like the salt marsh area in ecology, it is expanding in terms of awareness of the importance of the salt marshes, from a carbon sequestration point of view. But also then looking at, these larger scale restoration projects. So that's something that in Fingal we're very keen to do, but there's also parts of Europe where they've either worked on projects or are building projects and trying to fund projects. And touch wood, that will be where a lot of the funding comes from, because certainly a country like Ireland, yes, we do need to plant trees and we need to put them in, areas where there should be trees. But then our wetlands, our marshes, our seagrass meadows, seagrass can sequester carbon 33 times faster than trees, but also provides, food source and habitat for lots of species. So our estuaries, our sea area, we're only really starting to get, much more involved in those types of projects. But yeah, so I think watch this space.
Thank you.
Right. One more question, Lorraine, if you don't mind, would be on residential schemes, which we work on a lot, and they tend to be often separate, I suppose, to the wider landscape and the wider ecological corridor. I wonder, can you think of any good ecological corridors that travel through residential schemes that you've seen in your travels?
Yes, there's actually, and I didn't think I'd have time, so I didn't put it in this, but there's in Fingal, there's a new housing estate called Kellystown, which actually has got a really, really good plan for hedgerows. But also as well, it's not ready yet, but actually both Fingal Council, Dún Laoghaire and Dublin City are producing, the biodiversity officers, I should say, are producing a guidance for residential developments and developers. So that we have, had discussions about looking at multiple different things when it comes to providing areas for biodiversity. And again, that would cover, hedgerows, trees, wetlands, etc. So as I say, this topic is it's a large topic, and actually what might be an idea, Mark, and I just throw this out there, is that when that guidance is developed, is that maybe one of the speakers from one of the councils might get invited to actually talk about that document and its contents and some advice, particularly for residential developments. I mean, we were just actually as part of our CPD at a biodiverse green roof seminar there a few weeks ago, which was great. But there's also lighting. There's obviously SUDS measures. There's multiple different levels. I mean, residential estates and residential housing development, can, depending on the land that they're built on, but they can have then, actions and elements that are very positive for biodiversity. That could include the likes of swift bricks, within the foundation. There's also solitary bee bricks that you can get. There's the SUDS measures, there's the planting schemes, but also as well, it's having that, if you're buying a piece of land, or if a piece of land's been bought for housing development and it has a historic hedgerow, or it has a hedgerow, is actually retaining that, and retaining as much as you can of these existing habitats, because as I say, it takes a very long time for them to be developed. And then if you're putting in ponds or wetlands, I've seen schemes where there's like tall buildings either side and a small little pond in the middle. If I'm an animal, a lot of our animal species are prey. So you'd be better off actually putting that more at the side, or where animals can move to it freely without having to come into such interaction with buildings and possibly with people sitting outside the apartments. But there's lots of different elements. That's a whole other talk as well. So
Lorraine, thanks so much. We'll leave it there today. Super presentation. So thanks very much to you, and thanks to Hazel for organising it as well. As I say, if everyone would stay in touch via the website, they'll see all the upcoming CPDs, and myself and Hazel will follow up with Lorraine on some of the links and references and further info. So goodbye everyone, and thanks a million, Lorraine.
thanks you, Mark. Thanks, Hazel. Thanks, everyone.